Welcome, and thank you to Boswell Bookshop here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for hosting this interview with us, Porchlight Book Company. And I'm Sally Haldorson, Managing Director at Porchlight. We have the honor today of welcoming the renowned poet, Ada Limón. Ada is the author of 6 books of poetry, including The Carrying, which won the National Book Critics Award, Circle Award for Poetry. She is also the host of the critically acclaimed poetry podcast, The Slowdown. In her new collection of poetry, The Hurting Kind, she writes about the human experience of suffering, hurt, and hope. First, I am excited to talk with you, Ada. Welcome, because I get to thank you directly for your poetry and how much it has fed me when I have needed to find a source of strength or a refueling of my resilience. I'm thinking specifically for the audience who is here that may not have Ada's books in front of you. Make sure you write these down and Google them. But How to Triumph Like a Girl and Instructions on Not Giving Up. My experience reading this new collection has been similar to my attachment to those poems. I feel the hurt in each poem as a hurt that speaks to my hurt, but also the hope in each poem as a hope that speaks to my hope. And I am thrilled to meet you, thrilled to have you here, and I'm sure our attendees are super excited to hear from you. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And especially, I love to know that poetry has connected with someone or has moved someone or has been with them through their life, because, you know, what we do is such a private thing on so many levels, and such a, you know, I work in this office that I'm Zooming from in Kentucky, and oftentimes the person, you know, the first being hearing a poem is my dog, and it always feels like a very sort of small act. And so I mean, I can still remember the day I wrote How to Triumph Like a Girl. And so it's just, to me, it's so wonderful to hear those sort of personal and private acts, and how they have connected with someone and continue to connect with people. It feels sort of miraculous in a way. Anyway, I will read a poem. I'll just also want to apologize that I am recovering from a cold. So for anyone who is, I'm hoping that my voice stays with us.
Yes.
And this will be probably the most I've talked today, or in 2 days, because I was really trying to rest it so I can get back to recording the Slowdown tomorrow. Fingers crossed, because I had to bump it to recover from what I think is strep throat, or was strep throat.
Well, I'm excited to hear what you're going to read, and I have an unlimited number of things to talk to you about. So please take it away.
Oh, yay. Okay, wonderful. This is a poem from my stepfather. And I think just because I've been feeling a little under the weather, I want to read this poem. A good story. Some days, dishes piled in the sink, books littering the coffee table are harder than others. Today, my head is packed with cockroaches, dizziness, and everywhere it hurts. Venom in the jaw, behind the eyes, between the blades. Still, the dog is snoring on my right, the cat on my left. Outside, all those red buds are just getting good. I tell a friend, the body is so body, and she nods. I used to like the darkest stories, the bleak snippets someone would toss out about just how bad it could get. My stepfather told me a story about when he lived on the streets as a kid, how he'd some nights sleep under the grill at a fast food restaurant until both he and his buddy got fired. I used to like that story for some reason, something in me that believed in overcoming. But right now, all I want is a story about human kindness. The way once, when I couldn't stop crying because I was 15 and heartbroken, he came in and made me eat a small pizza he'd cut up into tiny bites until the tears stopped. Maybe I was just hungry, I said, and he nodded, holding out the last piece.
I love that poem. I'm so glad that you picked that one. I came back to that over and over again as I was sort of pulling on threads throughout the book. And I think that we can hold on to the word suffering in this poem. In fact, I have it here. I want to make sure I'm referring. We can hold on to something in me that believed in overcoming. And there are a number of ways throughout this book that we revisit suffering, we revisit overcoming, we revisit simplicity over complexity, we revisit like the complications that the mind brings to our body and our experience of living in this world versus, I think, and this will open up to a larger conversation, animals in the natural world and how they function in a way that maybe isn't as full of cockroaches and as full of those thoughts that we convince ourselves are really, really important, but are also really, really distracting. That is one of my favorites. So we'll come back to that. What would, for the, poetry is a genre that counts and depends as much on the reader participating in the poem, which is true in all genres. This is not to discount any other way that we experience art. But with poetry, we bring that interpretation ourselves to the poem. What do you hope that people hearing that poem experience as you read it? And how do you really hope that your audience receives your poetry generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because I used to really have this sense that I wanted people to really get exactly what was my experience. And that was important to me as a young poet. For many years, I thought that was what I needed to practice, the art of, telepathy, and be like, this is what I'm sending to you. Please see it exactly how I have written it or how I experienced it. And then, of course, as I've matured as a writer and as a human being, I'm now really curious as to what comes when other people read it. Right. And sometimes I had a woman come up to me the other day and I was like, she's like, well, I stopped listening because I was having this experience where I was going through my own experience. And you reminded me of that. And she was like, so I'm so sorry I didn't listen to the poem, but I had this wonderful, memory of my grandmother and this thing. And I remember thinking, that's beautiful. Like if my entry or whatever it was, the thing that pulled you towards a memory or an experience that was somehow reminded you what like the human experience is, or a moment of gratitude or whatever it was, felt so important to me that I think I'm relinquishing more and more as to what I want it to do for someone else. And I'm more and more interested as what it does for me as a writer and as an artist, and then as a human. And it matters to me that, like, in this particular poem, it really matters to me that my stepfather likes this poem. And it becomes a more intimate relationship with the work and the poem itself and the poem making. And it's less about sort of like how it will be received beyond his own perception of it. And so that he sees it as an act of gratitude and offering. And that, so that has shifted within me. I do think this poem in particular is about kindness, and it's about, I think there's a lot of stories in our lives about, the kind of the tough lesson, that when we learn the hard lesson and we got over the thing, or someone taught us the thing by being hard or tough. And especially when we deal with masculinity. And I feel like there's so much that is lost when we talk about masculinity, in terms of how we don't praise tenderness very often. And I wanted to take a moment to do that. And I think this poem sort of started out as like, he was praised in my mind for his toughness, for what he overcome, for, what he went through, for that sort of idea that he was like, this sort of invincible, strong person. And then I was like, what if I take a moment and instead just praise the simple kindnesses and the tenderness and that moment of connection that he has with his little stepdaughter, who's just like crying up a storm. And I thought that was really important to me, was that I think so often we praise men and women, but I think in particularly men, just for their like strength. And I wanted to praise for tenderness.
That reminds me of Cyrus and the Snakes.
Yeah.
And I think that poem does somewhat the same thing.
Yeah.
Where it's really an ode to that the tenderness behind the masculinity, or an act that is supposed to be masculine, like behaving the way that a boy is supposed to act, when in actuality, if it hadn't been witnessed, perhaps there was something more gentle and softer happening there. Would you want to read that poem?
I would love to. And I love how they kind of dovetail into it. It's funny, this book has so much of my family in it, that even when you said Cyrus and the Snakes, I got excited to hear his name. I'm like, that's my brother. Isn't that funny? Like because I think this was the first book. I mean, I've talked about my family in other poems, but in other books, but I think this is the first book that I've like really used people's names.
Right.
Instead of being like, oh, my brother, oh, my, like, and I kind of love that, that he's here in that way, in his full name. I read this poem in front of him in San Francisco, and I said, oh, my brother is here. And it was very sweet moment where everyone was, were masked, and everyone looked around and he was like,
yeah. It's like, do I want this spotlight?
Yeah. He's like, oh no, people are looking at me.
He's like, I'm gonna have to have a public moment.
Yeah, exactly. He's not a public person.
Right.
Okay. Cyrus and the Snakes. My brother holds a snake by its head. The whole length of the snake is the length of my brother's body. The snake's head is held safely, securely, as if my brother is showing it something in the distant high grass. I don't know why he wants to hold them. Their strong bodies wrapping themselves around the warmth of his arm, constricting and made of circles and momentum, slippery coolness smooth against the ground. Still, this image of him, holding a snake as it snakes as snakes do, both a noun and a verb and a story that doesn't end well. Once we stole an egg from the backyard chicken coop and cracked it just to see what was inside. A whole unhatched chick. Where we expected yolk and mucus was an unfeathered and unfurled sweetness. We stared at the thing, dead now, and unshelled by curiosity and terrible youth. My brother pretended not to care so much, while I cried, though only a little. Still, we buried it in the brush, by the creeping thistle that tore up our arms with their speared leaves, barbed at the ends like weapons stuck in the rattlesnake grass. But I knew that he'd cry if he was alone, if he wasn't a boy in the summer heat, being a boy in the summer heat. Years later, back from Mexico or South America, he'd admit he was tired of history, of always discovering the ruin by ruining it, wrecking a forest for a temple that should be simply left a temple. He wanted it to all stay as it was, even if it went undiscovered. I want to honor a man who wants to hold a wild thing, only for a second, long enough to admire it fully, and then wants to watch it safely return to its life, bend to be sure the grass closes up behind it.
So will not be the first time I get chills on my arms. It's a beautiful tribute. When you wrote that poem, were you consciously writing to him? Were you consciously writing to your small self? Like, what is the generative moment for something like that? A memory?
Yeah, this poem started with the snakes. He had actually sent me a picture a while back of him holding the snake, and he's holding it safely by its head, and it's literally like this, and it's just something he's found in the grass. And that image was with me, and I had realized that I had been writing so many animal poems, and I was partly interested and curious as to what it would be to lean into the obsession, right? I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm writing animal poems, I should pull back. And I was like, I'm doubling down. And so for me, it began with, okay, I have this snake, and I'm very interested in what it is that interests him in them. I really like snakes in terms of, looking at them from a distance, but I'm not someone that wants to hold them. And then I was really surprised at where the poem went. It completely was not, I had no idea. So I literally started with him and the snake, and just sort of kept pulling and see where it went. And that's really took that a different turn. I didn't expect it.
I think that, as you said earlier, then moments like that, what you captured there and reflected back, then, I have an older brother. And so this brings to mind, the photo of us feeding the lambs, or the photo, like it can bring those kinds of moments of tribute in ourselves, because we don't always pay the kind of attention to how formative those sort of casual occurrences in childhood actually were. And I think that that is definitely a thread that we can follow through this book. We have, I should ask you ahead of time.
Yeah.
And I do know that I did watch a reading that you did where I think you addressed this, but do we refer to the narrator of these poems as the narrator or the speaker, or do I refer to them as you? Or how do you prefer to talk about your poem?
Thank you for asking that. I think the speaker is always really helpful when you're in workshop, because it's not like, you can talk about hard subjects, or you can critique a poem and you're not critiquing the person. But these are all poems. I am the speaker. Yeah.
I had, is the I in your poems meant to be read as you or as the universal I, or is that up to the reader? Which I think is probably what happens, and what you were talking about is that this is you, but it is also us and what we bring to the poem. Yes. One additional sort of general poetry question to you, because I think it is one that's really applicable to our time now, whether we're talking about the attention poetry got with Amanda Gorman's work, and just sort of a general heightening of attention to poetry during the pandemic, and we might segue into the pandemic here, but I am curious about, there's a lot of debate about the accessibility of poetry and how accessibility equates or does not equate to quality. Plenty of people like to talk about that, but at the same time say that poetry is a necessity. It's essential to the human heart's hierarchy of needs, or as a common voice of the people, as a salvation during times of trouble, like a rallying cry. And of course, two or five things can be true all at the same time. Right. Where do you come down on accessibility, and how does it inform your work? And do you have feel like you have any kind of obligation to an audience, or are you really writing for yourself? That's a lot of questions in there. Feel free to go where you want.
No, I love it. I think that's a great question. And it's really clear to me, because I think that is a conversation that keeps continuing. And I know my work is in that part of that conversation, and is held up as examples from both sides on whether they think it's like, a good thing or a bad thing. And I think for me, I started writing poetry really for my family and to my friends. And um, in particular, like my stepfather, who's in this poem. And I was really kind of taught early on that it wasn't something that was sort of academic or an intellectual experiment, but rather something that was crafted to create a significant emotional response or connection, even just connection. And so I've always sort of honored that, even, from a very early on. Um, I think there was a time in my life in particular, going through graduate school and really focusing on the craft and really, really trying to hone my skill and trying to make sure that people knew that I was smart and people knew that I knew the prosody and the elements of craft that could build or break a poem, or to start to have, poetic references within my own work. But now for me, I mean, I'll reference poets all the time, and it doesn't mean if you've heard of them, or songs or music. And I don't feel like I'm doing that out of any kind of proving or sort of an intellectual experiment, but to really, like, that is what's on my mind, right? That it's like the poem is an actual honest portrayal of my weird and chaotic human brain on the page and what's happening with it. And so I think that I've let go of some of that audience expectation or readership ideas. And I think I've kind of had to, because I think for a quick second, when Bright Dead Things came out in 2015 and then did really well, I suddenly was like, I was read by like no one, and then I was read by a lot of people. And I had to figure out a way to kind of shut that expectation out and make sure that the readership, audience was not in the room while I was composing. So this book actually, and all the books since then, have all felt very private to me, but it's a work to keep it private and to make it private and intimate. And I think that in some ways, the more private I get, sometimes there is this element where people find it is reflecting their own world. And I'm impressed by that and amazed by that, but it's not what I start out doing. I don't write the poem and think someone will find something in this. Oftentimes I'm thinking, this is the poem I needed to write to save myself today. Or to send to a friend, or just because I missed my father, I would have sent this poem to my father, whatever it is. And so I think that that's the impulse and the intention for me needs to be as much as possible in the true making of the poem and in the true reason for the poem, as opposed to any kind of expectation beyond its life within my heart and my family.
You mentioned the poem you needed to survive that day. And I think we have a lot of moments in this book about finding small ways to survive, which are emblematic of finding the larger meaning. And of course, I am assuming that the majority of these poems were written during the pandemic. And I don't know if that would be true.
Yeah, I would say maybe half of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I run the risk of maybe identifying a few that are not pandemic survival poems, but maybe life survival poems. But there's a very specific sense of time in this collection. It obviously the sort of the constraint of the collection itself is 1 year of seasons, or just a cycle of seasons, depending on how you would want to look at that. But there's also a timelessness where I think the book can and will be read during non-pandemic times, which, yeah, exactly. And I'm wondering if you were sort of deliberately trying to side-eye the pandemic a little bit and not be too specific, but also capture it. Maybe another way of saying that is to capture it, but not center it. And I think that we are all just beginning to recognize sort of the reckoning that's going to happen with the fallout of the pandemic on every level, and that poetry can be a way of hastening healing, sharing that common experience. And I read Banished Wonders and Lover as two of the poems that speak to the pandemic, but not of the pandemic.
Totally.
So of either of those poems, is there one you would prefer to read? I would love to have you read one of them.
Either one. I mean,
can we do Lover?
Yeah.
Let's do that one. Because there's
I'm so glad you asked about that, because I do think when we talk about, I love how you said centering the pandemic, or not. And I think that there's, for me, this way in which it's very hard for me to take anything on, like really straight on, because it will often feel untrue to me. Or like I'm forcing it, or it's just for prose, right? Like this many people have died. This is what I'm, like it's huge and it's big and it's important. But I find with my poetry, I need to enter it from a different place. I can't enter it head on.
Right.
I can't do that, or it just falls apart. Like, even if I say, I'm going to sit down and write a poem about this, it's why occasional poetry is very hard for me. It's very hard in general,
right.
Which is why I think Amanda Gorman did actually such a beautiful job with that poem.
It's hard to imagine.
It's moment. So intense to have someone say, here's your assignment. I mean, can you imagine? And so I think, occasional poetry is like, it's not given a lot of credit, because everyone's like, oh, well, and I was like, because it is an assignment. It's literally, this is what it is supposed to do. It is a public poem, and a public poem is entirely different from a private poem. And they have different voices. They have different, they are meant to do literally something else. And so I think like taking something head on is very difficult. And for those people that can do it, and if you are tasked to do it, I urge everyone to try it. It's incredibly hard. But yeah, so this poem in particular is I think the closest, well, there's a few others, but this particularly had to do with the pandemic. Lover. Easy light storms in through the window, soft edges of the world smudged by mist, a squirrel's nest rigged high in the maple. I've got a bone to pick with whomever is in charge. All year I've said, you know what's funny? And then nothing is funny, which makes me laugh in an oblivion is coming sort of way. A friend writes the word lover in a note, and I'm strangely excited for the word lover to come back. Come back, lover, come back to the 5 and dime. I could squeal with the idea of blissful release. Oh, lover, what a word, what a world, this gray waiting. In me, a need to nestle deep into the safekeeping of sky. I'm too used to nostalgia now, a sweet escape of age, centuries of pleasure before us and after us, still, right now, a softness, like the worn fabric of a nightshirt. And what I do not say is, I trust the world to come back. Return like a word long forgotten and maligned for all its gross tenderness, a joke told in a sunbeam. The world walking in, ready to be ravaged, open for business.
I don't think anyone could listen or read that poem without feeling that connection to that hope that the world is coming back, and the things that have been can no longer be had. This is true again for the other poem that I mentioned as well, Banished Wonders, that we have in some ways had to make choices about what we value and how we spend our time. in a way that we didn't have to do before. Those constraints on our lives pushed us in a certain direction, but also pushed us away from things.
Yeah.
And now we have, the further away from things that we get, the more reflection we have on those and whether they are valuable. And I remember at probably during the first year, I thought, are we just going to bounce back? Is this just a rubber band where we're going to bounce back to where we were before? Like we've just been stretched to the end of our resources, but everyone's coveting what once was. And is that going to be the standard, or have we actually stretched the rubber band to the point where we have moved somewhere new and different? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that one of the ways to read this collection is about the nostalgia that you mentioned in this poem, but also memory in general. And then how responsible are we to bringing the past forward with us, and how much value is actually in nostalgia? How much is it about creating new, less earned with meaning things? I don't know if that's a thing. But how do you feel that you've navigated, and maybe this connects to the like cycle of nature through the seasons in the book, that it was progressive, but at the same time spirals and comes back again. I think that there is something that we can take from this collection when it with a sense of renewal. I don't know if that was deliberate or not.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I do have hope. I do. I don't know. I always laugh that I'm like, I think I'm a very earnest person, but I'm also very suspicious. And I can definitely live in the bottom of the well. But I think for the most part, like I really believe in hope. And I think that it's very dangerous to give up hope. And so I think this book has to have it because I had to have it. And, I love when people find the light in the book, because I know the book is heavy too. And it has a mix, right? I think it has a mix of the weightedness and then also the light. But I feel like there's so much there that I need to find those slivers of hope. And I think especially at this time when things feel so burdened and it feels like, oh, we had a moment of like, oh, the pandemic is sort of over and then we're vaccinated. And then there's a moment where there's a dip and now it seems to be coming back, and so many people we know have it. But luckily, hopefully not to the extent that we did pre-vaccination. And then at the same time, we have the school shooting, we have the shooting in Buffalo, we have all of these things. And I think that it's so hard not to lose hope in humanity. And I felt like maybe in some ways decentering humanity was useful, decentering myself, decentering our own sort of role in everything, which was like, what is the world without us? And even like watching the squirrels, and like this sort of idea of like, oh, what is it without me? Like they're having their moment. I would like to have a nest up there in that safekeeping of sky, like just sort of getting out of myself and my head and this sort of deeply troubled human body that we live in. But yeah, I mean, it's a textured answer because it's a textured question, which is, I know that I have it and I hold on to it, but I know that it's work. And I think hope is work.
Yes, that's a wonderful, just to highlight that, because I think some people think hope is easy and cynicism is work.
Right.
And I don't think that that's true. I think hope is is very active, right? And there are two poems that remind me, bring me back in this conversation. And I'm not sure, I don't think I could pick a favorite, but one of them is, let me see if I can get the title correct. It's The Seasons, I Forget. Is that it's The Seasons?
Oh, yeah.
And The Mountain Lion.
Yeah.
And in both of those poems, I get that sense of hope that, so the one with the seasons is obviously applies to this particular point in the conversation, which is about the construction of the book and using seasons and using the natural world to see that sort of cyclical process.
Yeah.
And sort of the reversal in this poem, if you would be willing to read this one.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. But this is in the fall section of the book, and even though we are in the spring section of our lives, at least here in North America, but I do feel like there's something. I'm actually not a fall person. It's very strange. But it's only because I'm not a winter person. So I get so scared of winter coming. That fall is just, it reminds me that winter is coming. But I every fall, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to love it. I'm going to love it. So I'm really working on my attachment to fall. It's the season I often mistake birds for leaves and leaves for birds. The tawny yellow mulberry leaves are always goldfinches tumbling across the lawn like extreme elation. The last of the maroon crab apple ovates are song sparrows that tremble all at once. And today, just when I could not stand myself any longer, a group of field sparrows, which were actually field sparrows, flew up into the bare branches of the hackberry, and I almost collapsed. Leaves reattaching themselves to the tree like a strong spell for reversal. What else did I expect? What good is accuracy amidst the perpetual scattering that unspools the world?
It's a remarkable image, and I think that it reflects scattered throughout the collection, this sort of use of, even though this is very literal, as opposed to interpretive with the leaves being birds, and these are actually birds flying back up into the tree. But I think there's something so magical about it. And there's a lot of magic to be found. You use the word conjuring at one point in one of the poems, and I think I'm not going to remember it correctly, but you refer to like a ghost of a cat walking back into the room, and just this way that we are revisited, and that if we continue to believe in the magic of things and the interpretive, choose to interpret things within a lens of magic as opposed to things falling apart. I think that's what we were sort of talking about, that hope is active and hope is work. And that's,
I think that's very true. And I also think that I love that idea of sort of giving up. Like, as poets, they're very insistent on getting the correct image and getting the accuracy of the name of the tree and the name of the bird and the name of the, whatever it is, all of the senses correct. But I think it's also sometimes we do have to release to not the facts, but the magic, the fact that for a moment there was every part of my bones and body that thought those birds flew back on that tree, and the leaves literally flew back onto the tree. And I thought, I'm witnessing that. And then, of course, no, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, they were birds. And of course, that's what I saw. Now I can see them in the tree. But that moment feels like such a gift because it throws yourself, it opens the door for possibilities of other things happening. Like, oh, if that could happen, what else could happen?
What else could happen?
And I think that's really important. And it goes back to hope is work, is that idea of like, oh, if hope is work, like, so is that believing in magic and believing in the scrim between worlds, and going back again to thinking that it's like, we're not always the center of this.
Mhm.
Like there's something else that's happening. Those birds and that image, that wasn't just for me, that was just this amazing thing that happened in this little small moment of my day. And who am I to think what was happening to me before that, or on email or on Zoom, or was more important. And I think there's also a getting away of that.
That reminds me of Drowning Creek, which is one of my favorite poems. And you highlight the distance between animals and humans. And you do this often in a number of these poems, is how humans reflect themselves onto animals, and whether that is maybe not right, maybe not morally right, but whether it's necessary to do that to love an animal or to appreciate an animal. Do we need to make them into more human? Do we need to anthropomorphize? The other way is then that the animals in many of your poems actually reflect back something that maybe we should long for more of. And maybe some sort of, I mean, I think that's true for the mountain lion, and I think that's true in Drowning Creek, where we have in Drowning Creek, you posit that this bird that you saw in a glimpse while driving in a car is not occupied by assigning meaning to things like humans are. People were nothing to that bird. I was nothing to that bird. That bird wasn't concerned with history or names. And you find the solitude of the bird's mind enviable. And that happens a lot also throughout this collection, where you're reflecting on the complications that our human brains bring to existence, that perhaps the animal, like you were saying about the squirrel's nest, and that sort of, I suppose, solitude then too, being up there and wishing you had that. Can you speak a little bit about what it is about, I don't know, is this too simplistic of a question, the animal experience that you think informs what you long for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very funny, as we're talking, these squirrels are building this crazy nest in the tree, and it's like outside in the silver maple, and they're just going bonkers. And I'm so excited. I mean, they're like walking around with like whole like branches in their mouth, basically like leaves. Clearly they want to be part of this conversation. I think that for me, I've always just been so interested in the fact that I remember being like 12 and sitting with my friend Aaron / Echo, who is actually a park ranger in Yosemite, and it's like has always been very connected to the natural world. And we were, I think we were quite young, and we were sitting there, and she was talking about like how weird it is that like we even consider another human being ugly, because she's like, we like in the natural world, like no one would be like, maybe it would be wounded or something, but it wouldn't, but there wouldn't be any part of us that would consider like, oh, that's an ugly lion, or I don't know. And so I remember having this discussion, this very sort of heady conversation as two 12-year-olds, like talking about what it was to remember that we are animals. And it felt really important, and it felt like, right, like we are an animal, we are a human animal, and with it comes a lot of baggage, and it becomes, with our highly evolved minds, becomes our highly chaotic and injured and hurting minds, and our hurting hearts, and our worry and our anxiety and our depression and our fears and our need for safety, and yet for some reason our insistence upon violence and all of those things. And I think it's not so much that there's a sort of simplicity in watching the animals, but I think there is a release in which I'm remembering that it's okay sometimes to just be,
Mm.
to watch them, like I'm watching them build this nest. And it's like, they're not worried about what's happening right now. They're going to make it safe, and what they're, and then they'll protect it against the crows, and all of those things will happen. But this sort of sense of ongoingness and the sense of the world that is going on without the constant chatter of the mind, I think is really important to me to always recognize it. And I think I feel most myself when I'm paying attention to that. And I feel sort of less ego and everything else, and it so brings me back to myself. It reminds me that I have core, and that inside that core, there is a stillness, and there is a peace, and there is a connectedness, and there is an instinct, and there is, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always healthy for me to live my entire world in my mind, which I think as artists, especially as poets, we often do. I mean, we give this like credit to like the language and the crafting and and I think sometimes it's really good for me to be like, it's not all up here, like to remember that there is more, that there's another level. And so, yeah, I feel like it's not simple, but I love that phrase too, but there's maybe a clarity of purpose.
Yeah.
That,
something
I
instinctual.
really admire.
Yeah. I think there are some we're gonna tantalize people with the mountain lion. They can definitely buy the book
that if you want.
Let's actually
Okay.
let's leave that as an unsatisfied desire for everybody now, because
I love that.
It's terrific. But I think because we have many more to talk about, and I think that that poem speaks to me in the same way that How to Triumph Like a Girl does.
Mm.
And how if we could actually turn off all the messaging sometimes that we have in our heads, that we would be far more courageous, and we would be far more brave, and we would be far more instinctual. And I think that and maybe treat ourselves more kindly. And I think that there is one of the things that so appeals to me about your poetry is the fact that it makes me feel more kind about myself, not just like human, but about myself. And
that made me want to tear up. Thank you.
And I feel that way. How to Triumph Like a Girl, The Mountain Lion, and one of my favorite poems, which is, let me see is the magnificent Frigate.
Oh, yeah.
Which you wouldn't, it surprised me, this poem. Like it took me by surprise. I don't think I have it. I don't have one of those copied. But can we read that one? Because I think everybody needs to be inspired to feel more kind to themselves. And we can be that.
I think that's so true. Like, I'm always impressed at the way we can be with each other, and how we show up for friends and family and people, and then how we can go to bed and be like, God, I look terrible in my nightgown. Like, what?
Right.
Like, what? Like, that's crazy to me. And I feel like, that's something I really pay attention to and work on. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes I'm still up there criticizing myself, or leaving a reading or a Zoom and being like, oh, what did I do, or whatever, and that's part of living. But I think also, like, not fighting myself, like, okay, yes, I did that, and now let's move on and let's be kind again. And that stuff, surprisingly truly works, like remembering what it is to cherish this, and really cherish it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lifelong process.
It is a lifelong process.
Keep going. I've crossed my fingers twice during this Zoom. I do not know why, but It's like I'm like the cross the fingers emoji. Like that was like the
Yeah,
little,
right.
yeah.
As long as we're not doing like the
Yeah.
mind blown and yeah.
So this is funny because I was actually with us. I was teaching in Rio,
Oh,
and I looked out the window, and it was just a one-on-one tutorial with this wonderful writer. It was from Colombia, and she was down there with us, and I looked out the window, and just I had never seen this bird before, and I learned the name in this poem.
which is the part of what makes the poem so amazing is the oddity of it, right?
Yeah, the actual name. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So this is called The Magnificent Frigate Bird. Is it okay to begin with the obvious? I'm full of stones. Is it okay not to look out this window, but to look out another? A mentor once said, you can't start a poem with a man looking out a window. Too many men looking out a window. What about a woman? Today is a haunting. One last orange on the counter. It is a dead fruit. We swallow dead things. Once in Rio near Leblon, large seabirds soared over the vast South Atlantic Ocean. I had never seen them before. 8-foot wingspan and gigantic in their confident gliding, black with a red neck like a wound or hidden treasure or both. When I looked it up, I learned it was the magnificent frigate bird. It sounded like that enormity of a bird had named itself. What a pleasure to say, I am magnificent. And two, they traveled as a team, so I wondered if they named each other, generously tapping on one another's deeply forked tail or their plumage, glistening with salt air, their guller sacks, saying, you are magnificent. You are also magnificent. It makes me want to give all my loves the adjectives they deserve. You are resplendent. You are radiant. You are sublime. I'm far away from tropical waters. I have no skills for flight or wings to skim the waves effortlessly like the wind itself. But from here, I can still imagine rapture, a glorious caught fish in the mouth of a bird.
I think we need to read that every day to ourselves and the people that we love. But also, I don't want to take away from, there's also something to me that in that last line and the idea of being the fish, which is actually out of its habitat, perhaps taking a wondrous flight, but also a flight to inevitable death.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like I think that it's a wonderfully positive and hopeful poem, but you never lose sight in any of these poems really about the fact that the urgency of these poems is about mortality.
Yeah.
And it's about the fact that these are fleeting moments.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part and the painful part of the words we put on the page, the pictures in a photograph, or remembrances of people that we no longer have with us for, all of the reasons. And so there is, I think there's a shadow on each, but that shadow, whether it's mortality or difficulty or suffering, which we've talked about, is what makes the hope so urgent and so necessary. And I think there are a lot of people these days who are saying, the world is worse than it ever has been.
Right.
And it takes work, as you said, hope is work, to think something other than that.
Yeah. And I think that when we get into that sort of area of despair, I think we have to remember that despair is very dangerous, because giving up is very dangerous for our earth, for each other, You know, if we just give up, what will become of us? And so I think hope is work, and it's also active. And I think that's really important to remember, because I feel very scared if we decide to despair and decide to give up. You know,
I am astonished that it is 6:57
oh my gosh,
and we are having to wrap up this conversation. But if we can just like squeeze in a moment to talk about the title poem, The Hurting Kind, to talk about oral storytelling, to talk about legacy, to talk about whether it's possible to sum up a human life. I'm making a big stretch there from, the shadow of mortality and the people that we remember. But that is obviously a significant poem in the book. It's also the longest poem in the book, I believe.
Yeah, it is.
So if we can give a moment to The Hurting Kind.
Yeah. I think for me, I mean, that with the idea of the title in that poem in particular is I wanted to just really honor what it was to be tender, to be sensitive, to allow ourselves grief. And I think so often, so many terrible things come out of not allowing ourselves grief or hurt, and not allowing to say, I'm hurt, I'm having a hard time. And yes, I believe in bravery and courage and strength. I believe in all of those things, but I also believe in tenderness and weakness and letting ourselves fail and crying. And I think I wanted to sort of honor that legacy of people who allow themselves to be tender to the world.
That is definitely reading this collection and being gifted with how you see the world so that we can expand how we see the world is certainly such a needed experience after the past few years. And just generally, I think even as this is read post-pandemic or with a sort of nostalgia, whether that is an appropriate word for this time, what anchors us is each other, and what anchors us is our participation in nature as animals, as participatory animals in this life. And I think you remind us of all of those things and more. And I'm so pleased to have gotten to speak with you. And I am sure that everyone who watches our recording will be as mind blown emoji, can't help but do it, from this conversation. And yes, and I hope that I encourage everybody, obviously, to buy all of Ada's books, but particularly this new one, because it is what we need at a time when we need it.
Thank you so much for all of your marvelous questions and for such a great, heartfelt conversation. I felt like I was just chatting with a friend.
I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you so much. And bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.